My name is Margaret Levy, and I'm a political scientist and director of the Center for Advanced Study in Behavioral Sciences. And it is my pleasure, really my pleasure, to introduce the Arrow Lecture and my friend Sam Bowles. The Arrow Lecture series on ethics and leadership is named in honor of Nobel laureate Kenneth Arrow, who was the Joan Kenney Professor Emeritus of Economics and Professor of Operations Research. Ken made many, many contributions to welfare economics, social choice theory, and collective decision-making, and he was also instrumental in the Ethics and Society program, and we miss him. He passed away in 2017. This is the second Arrow Lecture without Ken, but he schooled us well, and so Sam, please expect questions that aren't exactly like Ken's, because nobody could ask a question like Ken. But they're motivated by his agenda, an agenda with considerable overlap with yours. Ken Arrow was a mentor and a colleague and a fan of Sam Bowles. And like our friend Ken, Bowles has a commitment to creating a better and more equitable society. And like Arrow, Sam advocates the value of rigorous, mathematically informed work in achieving that end. And also like Ken, Sam recognizes the value of having the insights from that rigorous work reach a wider public. CORE, which is up there, which he had told me about some years ago, but I'd sort of forgotten, is now really becoming a very big thing in teaching economics through an online platform to thousands and thousands of people, and economics in a way quite different than it has traditionally been taught. So in Sam's case, he's very actively engaged with politics, with governments, and he does lectures that are both academic and popular, and as you can see, believes in engaging in collective and communal goods. Sam is the research professor at the Santa Fe Institute, where he heads up the Behavioral Sciences program. He taught economics at Harvard from 1965 to 73, and since then at the University of Massachusetts, from which he retired, but still goes back to teach regularly. He also teaches at the University of Siena. His PhD is from Harvard. Sam is a prolific writer, but more importantly, a significant contributor to at least two sets of major societal issues and the problems economics has in understanding them, at least neoclassical economics has in understanding them. The first set of issues has to do with inequality and its impact on the economy. With Herb Gintis, he wrote a seminal book that was published in 1976 and recently republished called Schooling in Capitalist America. More recently, he published The New Economics of Inequality and Redistribution, and there's a lot in between. But that first book that he wrote with Gintis was extremely influential on me. I have to tell my personal story here. I was a graduate student at Harvard at the time that they were writing it, and I went to lots of discussions of the book, and as did so many others, and it really had a huge impact on the way I think. I think I first encountered Sam when you were co-teaching, was it Soc Sci 10? What was
125.
125, Social Science 125, or Social Studies 125. And then got involved with a group that he was helping to lead and to found, IRPE, the Union of Radical Political Economists, something from the way past now. Sam got involved with the MacArthur Network on Inequality, which he proposed, as I recall, with Arrow and with Amartya Sen. Sam then became one of the leaders of the MacArthur Research Network on Evolution of Preferences and Social Norms, which led to the next body of work I want to identify, which has to do with cooperation, social preferences, and their evolution. With a series of other authors, and coming out of that research network, Sam produced a book called The Foundations of Human Sociality, Economic Experiments and Ethnographic Evidence from 15 Small-Scale Societies, which is really a book, a transformative book in thinking about the way in which people think about justice, inequality, about redistribution. And it sort of blows your mind in looking at these very different societies and how they deal with ultimatum games and dictator games, and how market societies behave in some ways with more fairness than some of the societies that we expect, who actually act in equitable ways, but have a very different notion of fairness. More recently, he's published with Herb Gintis, his longtime colleague and co-author, A Cooperative Species, Human Reciprocity and Its Evolution. The book he's going to talk about tonight, The Moral Economy, Why Good Incentives Are No Substitute for Good Citizens, is very much part of this larger project on cooperation, the evolution of social preferences, and commitments by people when they will, in fact, engage in public good provision. It was published by Yale University Press in 2016. It takes up themes that are current in modern political theory and political philosophy. Michael Sandel, our own Deborah Satz, have written beautifully on this subject. And Bowles' approach has a lot of overlap, but is also grounded in a different tradition, grounded in economics and in experimental research. We'll end by citing Robert Armstrong's review in the Financial Times. He said of the book, "We all invoke the cliche that not everything has a price, as an offhand rejection of economic analysis and an appeal to more humane considerations. Bowles shows why we should instead treat the slogan as a basic premise of sound economic thought." Sam.
Armstrong, that was great. Thanks for coming. Thanks for your interest in this work. It's a great honor to be here, remembering Ken Arrow, who contributed to this work a great deal, and I discussed it with him at length over a very long period of time. The setting in back of you is on the City Hall of Siena, Italy, where I teach, and it comes from a period in which it was taken for granted that good government had to do with good morals. I'm going to tell you a story about how that particular view was replaced by another view, and and I'd like to outline some of the difficulties we now encounter because of that substitution. Because it's a complex argument, I'm going to summarize it at the outset. The first is an observation that in designing public policy, legal systems, and so on, it is often said that we should assume, at least on grounds of prudence, that everybody is amoral and self-interested. But, and the second point is, it's anything but prudent to make this assumption. In fact, the assumption can be quite counterproductive, even dangerous. There are two reasons for this. The first is that assuming that people are selfish and designing governance systems or incentives to relate to a selfish individual often makes people act more selfishly than they would otherwise have acted. And I'll provide some evidence of an experimental nature for that. I think it perhaps corresponds also to your intuitions. The second reason why it is not prudent to adopt this view is that fines, subsidies, and so on don't work very well, and they're inadequate to address the problems we now face as human beings in the world today. I'm not suggesting we can do without incentives. What I'm suggesting is that they're necessary but very insufficient. I'll start in a place, partly because this is also the first thing that Ken wrote about this particular topic, the gift relationship by Titmuss. A conclusion was that the commercialization of blood and donor relationships represses the expression of altruism and erodes the sense of community. It was a very important book. It was widely discussed. The idea was that public-spirited motives are crowded out by incentives, and therefore we should use incentives less frequently. Now, it's interesting that that book was published at the same time that actually a very distinguished person at this university, Mark Lepper, I don't know if Mark's here, was doing work on exactly this problem. It was called Self-Determination and Over-Justification in Psychology. Had not been read by economists. But remarkably, the book by Titmuss was read by a number of quite distinguished economists. And it's not often that distinguished economists, even as broad-minded as Ken Arrow and Bob Solow, it's not often that they read books written by sociologists or social policy people, and much less spend the time to write very, very thoughtful reviews. Nonetheless, Arrow and Solow both were skeptical. This is Arrow's conclusion in an otherwise very engaged review of Titmus's book. Why should it be that the creation of a market for blood would decrease the altruism embodied in giving blood? I do not find any clear answer in Titmus. I see no real evidence that the presence of a commercial blood supply decreases the amount of altruism. Well, that's pretty critical because that was Titmus's main point. And I think Arrow was right. There was not good evidence for it. It was an otherwise very well-researched book. But since Titmus and since Arrow wrote that, a lot has changed. The reason why Arrow and Solow were skeptical, justly, is that there was indeed little evidence that ethical or other regarding behavior was an important in determining how we act. I mean, there was very little evidence and virtually none in economics. And there was even less evidence that somehow incentives would diminish that aspect of moral behavior. Since then, economics has changed a lot. And I'll say a few things about this in the course of this lecture, but just let me summarize. First, there's experimental evidence, which has shown quite clearly that there's overwhelming predisposition to act in an ethical or other regarding way, even when there's big money on the table and a lot's at stake, and even when we're acting anonymously. So social preferences matter. The second is, in economics, a rather technical innovation. In the last 30 years, it's been taken as more or less obvious, something that lawyers know, that contracts are not complete. They don't ensure the delivery of everything you would like in an exchange. A loan contract cannot ensure that the loan will be repaid. The person may be bankrupt. The employment contract cannot ensure the worker works hard. It's not covered in the contract. There's no statement about exactly what the worker is to do. The incomplete contracts, therefore, make it important that the social preferences are actually there so that the person will actually tell the truth about what he's going to do with the money he's borrowing, or how hard she's going to work may be influenced by her work ethic and so on. So these 2 points go together. The fact that contracts are incomplete makes the social preferences really be important, a point, by the way, which Arrow stressed in 1971. The last, even more seemingly technical point is what's called in economics the Lucas critique. This is a statement about macroeconomics, which is a rather broad application. What Lucas said is that if you intervene in the economy with some policy, that intervention itself is going to change the way the economy behaves because it'll change people's beliefs. So that we have to think about the policy making as one in which the beliefs that people have are endogenous and themselves respond to policy. So that if we talk about an equilibrium following a policy intervention, what has to be stationary in the equilibrium is not just the allocation of resources, but the beliefs that sustain that allocation. Now, you say, what does that have to do with this? It has everything to do with this. All you have to do is substitute the word preferences or morals for beliefs, and you have an extension of Lucas's critique. Now, I think Lucas's critique is a very important point about public policy, applied now to the effect of incentives, the effect they may have on our moral values or the salience of moral reasoning is a very important point to raise. Now, partly because of the 3 things there outlined in red, economists have now rediscovered Aristotle. I suspect that actually many of them discovered Aristotle for the first time recently, but of course we all say we went back and we read Aristotle. This is a passage which will be well known to many of you. Lawgivers make the citizen good by inculcating habits in them, and this is the aim of every lawgiver. If he does not succeed in doing that, his legislation is a failure. It is in this that a good constitution differs from a bad one. Not this is an aspect of a good constitution, this is the criterion of a good constitution, the creation of a good citizenry. Now, that poses a problem, doesn't it? Because if Titmus is right, that incentives undermine moral values, and if the sophisticated legislator, in Aristotle's terms, is charged with creating a moral citizenry, then it seems that the legislator would have to be rather constrained in the use of incentives so as to avoid undermining the morals, which is the main task of the legislator to support. That's the problem. But, of course, maybe the legislator shouldn't worry. And now economics now comes in and provides many reasons why actually this dilemma between Titmus's point, which now seems to be that we have some evidence for that, and Aristotle's legislator's charge that he should be or she should be engaged in uplifting, stabilizing, and so on, a civic culture that's consistent with good government. Now, it goes back to Machiavelli. This is from the Discourses, not from the Prince, sorry. All men are wicked. Hunger and poverty make them industrious, and laws make them good. Now, by the way, this is not at all a reflection of Machiavelli's thought. He was a very sophisticated reasoner about the interaction between laws and morals in society. But this particular view was then sort of taken up. The idea here is it's not that laws make you good, the laws make you act as if you're good, and that's good enough. That was the idea that economists later learned from this. And there were many saying similar things. The idea is that we should try to design a constitution that would work for people who were perhaps not ideal citizens, again, at least as a matter of prudence. In economics, at least when we look back retrospectively, a key moment was the publication of The Fable of the Bees by Bernard Mandeville. It was in verse, and it was about bees, because it would be too scandalous to say what he had to say about human beings. Listen to him. Thus, every part was full of vice. He's describing a hive of bees, and these bees were really nasty, and they were selfish, and so on. Every part was full of vice, yet the whole mass a paradise. Such were the blessings of that state. Their crimes conspired to make them great. The worst of all the multitude did something for the common good. Now, notice what this is. This is a fantastic statement of the way economists think, which is basically we should always distinguish between motive and consequence. Very good idea that Mandeville had. And he was playing with these ideas about how maybe self-interest was okay. A subtitle of one version of his book was, "Human frailties may be turned to the advantage of civil society and made to supply the place of moral virtue." Now, the classical economists then, Adam Smith most notably, came along and showed actually how this might be done. Mandeville had nothing to say really about the institutions of society, but for Smith, he famously said, "It's not from the benevolence of the butcher, the brewer, or the baker that we expect our dinner, but from their regard for their own interest." That's a very famous statement, and of course there's a wealth of nations. This then becomes part of a sort of public policy stance very early, even actually before Smith, with Hume. Hume wrote, "Political writers have established it as a maxim that in contriving any system of government, every man ought to be supposed to be a knave, and to have no other end in all of his actions than his private interest. By this interest we must govern him, and by means of it make him, notwithstanding his insatiable avarice and ambition, cooperate to the public good." Now, be careful, notice what Hume is saying. He's not saying that we are avaricious and selfish, and by the way, neither was Machiavelli. Machiavelli was saying, it is often said that, and then that thing I quoted, the sentence after here in Hume is that it's strange that something which should be wrong in fact, namely that we're all avaricious, should be a principle of constructing a constitution. Bentham then put forth in his text, which is really the first really intervention of what we now call public economics, what he called a duty and interest junction principle, which was to make every man's interest to observe that conduct which it is his duty to observe. So trying to get the interests aligned with the duties. And in economics, that's what we call incentive compatibility. We try to arrange incentives so that people will voluntarily and with the pursuit of their own objectives do the thing which is right. But it's not that that is Bentham, was talking about compensation of public officials in that passage. It's not to persuade the officials to act morally, it's to give them incentives that they'll act as if they were moral, but they are not. So here's the crucial thing which was then introduced from Machiavelli up until the 18th and 19th century. Good laws came to be a substitute for good citizens as the sine qua non of good governance. And I won't give you the whole history of this. Of course, it's very resonant with modern day economics. this is in 1988, a different stock market or financial crash. Ban greed, no, harness it. The important passage here in the Times editorial, perhaps the most important idea here is to distinguish between motive and consequence. Derivative securities attract the greedy the way raw meat attracts piranhas. But so what? Private greed can lead to public good. The sensible goal for securities regulation is to channel selfish behavior, not to thwart it. Now, does that sound exactly like Mandeville? It's exactly a restatement of those views as part of economic reasoning. So the economists also have tended to see markets, I think quite correctly, as a way of economizing on virtue. If we really can harness greed, the way Machiavelli or Hume said, then why should we worry about the fact that those incentives and so on might actually undermine morals? If you can harness all of these things to public objectives, it might be that social preferences are really irrelevant. And that's the way economics has treated the subject until quite recently. This is Hayek. The liberal market economy is a system under which bad men can do least harm. It doesn't depend on our finding good men for running it, or that all men becoming better than they are now. Or Charles Schulz, market-like arrangements reduce the need for compassion, patriotism, brotherly love, and cultural solidarity. Or, I think most importantly, a really very insightful passage from Buchanan. He's talking about buying some fruit at a roadside stand in Virginia. I do not know the fruit salesman personally. I have no particular interest in his well-being. He reciprocates this attitude. I don't know, I have no need to know whether he's in the direst of poverty, extremely wealthy, or somewhere in between. Yet the two of us are able to transact exchanges efficiently because both parties agree on the property rights relevant to them. Now that is exactly right. And he's really put his finger on why it is that that might be possible. As long as the property rights are clear, as long as you know what you're exchanging, that means complete contracts, by the way, as long as the contract is complete, what Buchanan is saying is quite right. You can actually conduct exchanges without a concern for the other person's need or for their morality or anything else. If he cheats you, you just call the cops and you get your money back. That's what a complete contract means. So this is a view which doesn't require us to think that morality is somehow irrelevant, but it means that we can design an economy in which it's kind of okay if people are self-interested and amoral. So this is repeating the question, why is it that economists think that we need not be concerned with preferences? Well, I think it's because economists have a theory, and I say we, being one, and I've actually contributed to this body. We have a theory that shows that desirable social outcomes are possible with unrestricted preferences. Unrestricted preferences is just a technical expression, meaning you can have any kind of preferences you want, whether selfish, generous, whatever, it doesn't matter. When we lay out a model, we don't say what the preferences are. And we don't say that whether they include anybody else, whether they include only my bread and my wine, or yours too, or anything of the kind. Now, this view that we put forward is that the market is decentralized and it's a privacy-preserving allocation mechanism. It means that, when guided by a benign and but not omniscient state, it's capable of implementing outcomes that achieve the following objectives. You avoid coercion or paternalism, avoiding those two things, and you can implement an efficient outcome. I'm going to say something about those three desiderata. Avoiding coercion, avoiding paternalism, that would mean some kind of restriction on the preferences, and free of waste just means Pareto efficiency in this literature. Okay, free of waste means any outcome, the outcome that the system will support will be such that it will be impossible to make one person better off without making somebody worse off. Preference neutrality, sometimes called liberal neutrality, actually a rather recent term in the philosophical literature. It just means that we require no special assumptions about the nature of people's preferences, their commitment to telling the truth, for example, or any particular way of life that they would like to pursue. And finally, we would like to avoid coercion. We can't require people to participate in any exchange or any other kind of mechanism, meaning system of incentives, laws, and so on. Now, this idea that these three things were compatible in a market society would be very reassuring were it true. Because what it would mean is that we really, of course, we're going to be concerned with preferences in our children and our friends and the people we love and who love us and so on. But we don't have to worry if they're being undermined because of the capacity to simultaneously meet those three objectives. And one of Ken's colleagues, and with whom he proved what's called the invisible hand theorem, this is Gerard Debreu. He, as you can see, he said the superiority of liberalism has been mathematically demonstrated. It's actually, Figueroa didn't actually quote him correctly, so I'll tell you what he actually did say. It's pretty close. The superiority of the liberal economy is incontestable, and so on. So that is what Debreu thought had been shown by the fundamental theorem of welfare economics that he and Ken proved. So this is the idea. What we call the liberal trinity is this simplex in which we can have Pareto efficiency, voluntary participation, and preference neutrality at the same time. The vertices are the three desiderata that I've outlined. Now, so if that's the case, why not a constitution for knaves? If it turns out that the incentives generate knaves, well, I mean, that's okay, because we can harness the knaves as well as we can harness the altruistic and so on. Now, the liberal trinity is actually a trilemma. I'll explain to you, this is a somewhat technical part of the literature. I'll explain to you, I think quite simply, why you can't have all three. You can have any two, but you can't have three. Here I'm simply repeating a large body of literature, actually since the time that Debreu made that kind of outlandish statement. I think it's safe to say that the economists in the field of what's called mechanism design would not disagree with the following rather pessimistic summary. The implementation of Pareto efficient outcomes in the absence of complete contracts is generally impossible for unrestricted preferences. If participation is voluntary, and if there's a limit on the extent of penalties that can be imposed, for example, imprisonment, physical punishment, or vast fines which may exceed the wealth of the individual. Now, there's a lot to this, so I'll just tell you what I think we can agree on. That one of the problems is there's no way to get people to truthfully say what their preferences are. It's even the case that private bargaining, when you don't have the problem of incomplete contracts, when you have complete contracts, private bargaining can be shown not to implement a Pareto efficient outcome. And there's a number of wonderful papers in this literature. We have the following problem. The mechanism design literature has quietly abandoned the standard definition of Pareto efficiency. And there is now a thing called incentive efficiency, which seems to be like Pareto efficiency, but basically all it means is doing the best you can given the preferences. And of course, you can do better if people are committed to truth-telling, or if people will honestly say how much they value the good and so on in all of these bargaining problems and so on. So essentially, the goalposts got changed, and now we have something which isn't Pareto efficiency at all. So these are the people who were fantastic mechanism design people. And it's really their Hurwicz, Meyerson, and Maskin, to whom we owe such a great debt, as well as some of the others who I mentioned. So Sung-Ha Wang and I have done some work on the bargaining problems that underlie this. And essentially, the graph says, let's see if I can point here. We can have Pareto efficiency and voluntary participation. But then in order to have this be efficient, we have to have restrictions on preferences. For example, a commitment to either altruism or truth-telling or something of the kind. We can have Pareto efficiency and preference neutrality, but then the only way to solve that problem in a public goods setting is to require people to participate in the mechanism before they know their wealth or their assets, in which case, of course, and the reason for that is once they find out what the mechanism is, some of them would withdraw and the mechanism wouldn't work. So, and here, this is what was shown in the early 80s, you can have voluntary participation and preference neutrality, but then you have unrealized gains from trade. That is, there's some trades which would be mutually beneficial which won't take place. Now, what this shows is that to the extent to which economics seem to tell us that we didn't have to care about preferences, that's wrong. It didn't tell us that. And by the way, that's been known for 20 years. I mean, none of this literature is new, except when there's some new stuff about social preferences, the work that Huang and I are doing about exactly what kinds of violations of preference neutrality will solve the problem, how much altruism would solve it, and so on. So this is, of course, that's Kenneth Arrow. Virtue remains indispensable. And let me summarize the reason why before saying how it was that Kenneth Arrow summarized it. Where the relevant information is not verifiable, that means cannot be used in a court of law, then contracts will be incomplete. I've given you the examples: work, credit, most information, and so on. Now, policy implementation capacities are limited and should be limited in the sense that there should be limits on the extent to which you can impose penalties, physical penalties, and so on individuals. That's something which we cherish. Now, if that's the case, if the first two bullets are right, then it follows that other regarding preferences and ethical commitments will permit some exchanges to take place which couldn't otherwise happen. In other words, that opens up the space for mutually beneficial trade to occur. And this is Arrow. The process of exchange requires, or at least is greatly facilitated by the presence of several virtues, not only truth, but also trust, loyalty, and justice in future dealings. That's from his review of Titmus. And in the same year, he wrote in a different paper summarizing what the so-called invisible hand theorem really meant. He said, in the absence of trust, opportunities for mutually beneficial cooperation would have to be foregone. Norms of social behavior, including ethical and moral codes, may be reactions of society to compensate for market failures. Now, so he's saying there, that's the early 70s, he's saying we have to be concerned because he already, this is before the results in mechanism design that I outlined, but he intuitively understood pretty well that we're not going to get there so that we don't have to care. And now we know that's pretty much the case. Now, let's think about where economics went wrong. The classical economist, I quoted Hume and Bentham, but I could have quoted others, including Mill. Mill the younger. The key assumption among the classical economists is something which, again, has a slightly mathematical flavor to it. It's called separability. They never used the word, but I'll explain what it means. They didn't for a minute think that people were amoral and self-interested, by the way. I mean, think about Adam Smith, think about Hume, and so on. That was not an empirical statement. What they thought was that, to use their language, the moral sentiments and the material interest could be pursued independently. In the following sense, policies which are designed to shape behavior according to the material interest, incentives, for example, or fines, could be introduced without affecting the moral sentiments, which might also be part of getting the right outcome for public policy. So the key assumption here is that incentives are introduced, and the only way that they act is by altering the benefits and cost of some targeted activity, whether it's smoking or staying in school or losing weight or voting or whatever it is. The incentive is just affecting the cost and benefits of that activity. It has no effect on preferences or beliefs. I'll show you in the next slide what happens if that's false. And these propositions now are the foundation of most of what we do on optimal taxation and in public economics, mechanism design, and so on. So let's lay out what this means schematically. And I'm trying to make clear to you what the word separability means. You can use the word additivity if you want, and sometimes the word additively separable is used. It means as you vary the amount of something, it doesn't alter the effect of the other thing. That's what separability means in mathematics. So here's a case. Over there on the right, we have some pro-social action, like giving to a public good. And then the individual, then there's some incentive as maybe a subsidy. And we want to see how does the subsidy affect the pro-social action. Well, the standard view is the top line. The incentive here has a positive effect on the own material payoffs. That is, it costs you less or you benefit more if you give, and that has a positive effect on the pro-social action. What they explicitly excluded was the bottom row, which is you may be contributing to the public good for reasons in addition to, or maybe even without public incentives, this here, and the incentive may have either a negative or a positive impact on the social preferences. And that's where non-separability comes in. So if you look at the total effect is this positive root here, and this possibly negative root. This is the total effect. The total effect is the direct effect. That's this thing here, and the indirect effect. If either this arrow here is 0 or this arrow there is 0, then there's no problem. There is possibly additivity. The real problem comes, and this is what I'm going to turn to next to convince you that it really happens a lot, that this incentive here may negatively affect social preferences. Now notice I have a plus sign there too. What that means is it could be that the incentive actually enhances the salience or the importance of the public objectives and so on, and that's called crowding in. And before I finish, I want to give you some examples of that, because it seems to me that for us, that is thinking about designing a decent society, we don't want to think about getting rid of incentives. We want to think about refashioning problems so that incentives can have a symbiotic effect, a complementary effect with moral reasoning rather than as a substitute. But first, the bad news. There's a lot of crowding out. Sandra Polania, there she is. She's running an experiment in the streets of Bogota. The Boston firemen, I bring that guy up because just before Christmas some years ago, the fire commissioner in Boston noticed that there were a lot of sick call-ins, and they happened to be coming on Friday and Monday, which he thought didn't sound very plausible. And so he said, up until that time, they had unlimited amount of sick calls. And in fact, there weren't that many sick calls, but he was annoyed that there's obviously some exploiting the system. So he said they wouldn't be paid. There's a limit to how many sick calls. Their pay would be docked if they exceeded that. And it was right before Christmas. And on Christmas Day and New Year's Day, the number of sick call-ins doubled after he threatened them this way. And in the year following, the doubling of the sick calls continued. And the fire commissioner eventually withdrew. That's an example of a situation in which something happened when he said, I'm going to fine you. It changed, of course, the benefit and cost of calling in sick, but it also changed how the firemen felt about the job they were doing. They often came in when they were sick. They often took risks on the job. These are very public-spirited people, and they felt insulted. Or that's what they said to the Boston Globe reporter who wrote this. Sandra and I published a bunch of papers. Probably the easiest, if you're interested in the data, go to our paper in the JEL, Journal of Economic Literature, or the book that Margaret kindly mentioned. There's a very large number of studies. Most of them were not done to identify the crowding out phenomenon or crowding in. So we had to extract from them the best we could do. And I'll give you an example in the next couple of slides. What they showed was that there was crowding out was a very common phenomenon, and sometimes it was empirically large. But there was also crowding in, as I say. We're going to talk about that as well. Now I'm going to introduce a little bit of language because we want to essentially chunk up this complicated thing of crowding out. And I think there are two distinctions that might be useful. The first is the nature of the crowding phenomena. Now it can be categorical, meaning the presence of the subsidy just changes everything. subsidy or fine. If there's a material incentive, it changes the meaning of the thing. Or it could be marginal, which is it depends on the size of the subsidy. And both of those are possible, and I'll show you that both of those are apparently at work in experiments. So that's the first distinction. But the second one is actually a more subtle one. There are ways in which an incentive imposed over a long period of time might change how people are brought up, how they come to have values in their life, the values which they come to live by. That's what we would call endogenous preferences. That's real learning. That is, living in a society organized one way as opposed to organized another leads you to act and believe that people ought to act in a certain way. Situation-dependent preferences, that's a term which would be natural to a psychologist. I think an economist might call them state-dependent preferences, are situations in which the incentive is itself a clue to the right behavior and is temporary. That is, if you have an incentive, well, then you should be acting this way. Take the incentive away. You haven't changed. It's just a different cue about how you ought to behave. Now, obviously, the endogenous preferences is a fantastic body of work to study, but we can't really do it in experiments because we're talking about how people learn things, more or less how you learn an accent or something over the course of your life. We have studied these things historically. We've studied them using anthropological evidence. But I'm going to focus mostly now on what I call state-dependent or situation-dependent because you're more likely to be able to look at those in a 2-hour experiment. You don't expect people to change their way of life in a 2-hour experiment, but they do get signals for appropriate behavior. So this is now coming back to the Lucas critique. If these things are going on, either categorical or marginal, crowding in or out, by the mechanism of either situation or state dependence or endogenous preferences, then when you intervene in a society, you need to be sure that not only are people going to change the behavior that you want, given the preferences that they had to start with, but the preferences that they end up with will end up supporting, that means maintaining the kind of outcome that you want. So it's just a bigger idea about what a Nash equilibrium is, which includes that the people's beliefs and their values have to be stationary. So let's look at a particular experiment. This is an experiment with a public goods game. A public goods game is roughly a prisoner's dilemma with more than 2 people. The dominant strategy is to give nothing. Well, actually, in this case, it's not. It typically is, but it's not. Let me walk you through the experiment. In one treatment, there was no incentives about giving. In the others, those who contributed got some recompense. That is, they were paid in money. They spent some money in the public good, but they got some return. They got a subsidy. And so we had 0 subsidy, a subsidy of 12 something, and a subsidy of 60. The solid dots are how much they actually gave. And they here gave 37 units with no incentive, 38 some, and they gave more. So the incentive worked. Now, the hollow dots really give us a lot of information. The hollow dots are how much a purely selfish person would have given in those situations. A purely selfish person would have given 25 here, 30 there, and 60. So now look at that data and tell me what you see. Well, when there was no incentive, they gave a lot more than a selfish person would give. I mean, that's a difference of 12 or something, right? But so when they introduced the incentive, sure enough, they gave more. But the difference between how much they gave and how much a selfish person would give shrunk. And when you get the high incentive, look what happened there. They're not different at all. So when you have the high incentive, the people who acted unselfishly in the absence of the incentive are now acting selfishly. So the incentive converts them to being selfish. Now, this is interesting. You look at the thing, if you just looked at the experiment and didn't think a little bit about it, you'd say, well, sure, experiments work. There's no crowding out. But obviously there's crowding out because at the end of the day, all you're getting is a selfish reaction from people. And this is, by the way, repeated over and over and over. That's what Sandra and I were able to show. This is very, very common. So let's think about what we can say. Suppose the people were, they would voluntarily give this much, that purple dot. And now suppose that there is no crowding out. Then when the incentive went up to 12, they should have given 44. And here when the incentive went up to 60, they should have given 62. But they didn't. So now what was happening here is that there is both this whole line shifted down. That's categorical crowding out. It just means the incentive itself is ruining things. And also it got flatter. And so the purple line here is our estimate of, that says that if you had given them an epsilon incentive, an arbitrarily small incentive, what effect would that have had? It would have been negative. Just any incentive, penny, whatever, was going to lower the amount of contribution. So basically what this says is that using experiments, we can actually identify the categorical crowding out and the marginal crowding out. And now I'm thinking, okay, suppose you're a mechanism designer or a policymaker. This is the kind of information you're going to need. You want to know what this thing is like, because that's your technology. You've got a subsidy, and you've got some reactions that people are going to make, taking account of the way in which the incentive itself affects their beliefs, and that's what you're going to use to implement an outcome. I mentioned Mark Lepper here, not because he's from Stanford, but because he's somebody I've learned a great deal from, and I really do regret not contacting him before I came. But he has provided in an old paper a way of thinking about incentives, and I'd like to read, I've added the numbers, but this is just from him and his co-authors. The multiple meanings of the use of tangible rewards are reflected in our everyday distinction between bribes and bonuses, incentives and salaries. They carry different connotations concerning, for example, the likely conditions under which the reward was offered. That is, what was the reason for the reward? The presumed motives of the person administering the reward. What does it reveal about the principal in a principal-agent problem? And the relationship between the agent and the recipient of the reward. Well, that's pretty good advice, because if you're going to be a public policy intervener, it doesn't help you just to know that crowding out happens. You have to begin to understand the mechanism of it. You have to get inside the black box, because you want to figure out how you can change how incentives may be trashing moral reasoning. So let's think about how we might design better public policy. We need to know more about how the crowding takes place. Well, here's an example. Juan Camilo Cardenas, a wonderful behavioral economist at the Universidad de los Andes in Bogota, does public goods games, or they're very similar to public goods games, common pool resource games in rural Colombia, and has done so for many years. What you see first here is just, this is how far did they deviate from what a selfish person would do. So that's not what they gave. This is how generous they were. The higher up it is, it means that's the more generous. So the two groups were, in the first rounds of the game, had the same treatment. And they're going to differ on the next click. But you can see that basically those two groups were the same. Then what he did, one group he said, okay, you can talk for 5 minutes, and then after that we play the game anonymously. The other group, he said, if you don't give the right amount, we're going to fine you. We're going to fine you. The experimenter's going to fine you. So here's what happened. The red line is the group that could communicate. And as you can see, being able to communicate helped them, but not surprisingly little, actually. What's interesting here is these people are not acting very selfishly. They're deviating from the selfish actor quite a bit. And when they got to talk with each other, maybe make eye contact or whatever, they acted a little bit more generously. On the other hand, the ones who were threatened with a fine initially deviated a lot. They basically more or less did the unselfish thing. But by the time we got to the end of the game, they were just acting completely selfish. Now, remember, that's exactly what happened in the previous experiment about the public good. That is, in conditions in which, in the absence of an incentive, people acted pretty generously, you got them to act as if they weren't generous at all. Now, what's crossing your mind is, well, why don't we just fine them more, and then acting selfishly, they'll protect the environment? Well, that's exactly the paradigm I'm talking about, which says, yeah, if we can crank up the incentives enough, we don't really have to worry about the fact that the incentives may be destroying the social preferences that we're interested in. I want to come back to that because I'm convinced, and I don't think I'll have any difficulty convincing any skeptics here, there are a whole range of problems in society which we cannot address simply by cranking up the cost and benefits of some targeted activity. But I'll leave that until the very end. I think using psychological terms, the best explanation of the Cardenas experiment is moral disengagement. It's a familiar category in psychology. People are willing to do bad things in a darker room, or even if they are wearing dark glasses, and so on and so on. Moral disengagement is the incentive itself seems to exculpate the behavior because it asks you to think about it as a benefit-cost problem. Let's think about one more experiment before I go on. This is a trust game. In a trust game, it's a two-person game. The experimenter awards some amount of money provisionally to the first person, and that first person is then able to pass some amount of that to the second person. When it arrives at the second person, it's tripled in quantity, and then the second person can send some back, including none. Okay? Now, you don't have to be very deep into game theory to figure out how this game would be played if you were entirely selfish and if you assumed that everybody was selfish. Backward induction sounds difficult, but it's not in this case. All you have to do is say, oh, I'm the first one. The other guy's selfish. He's not going to send back anything. I'm not going to send anything. And it's that simple. Well, that's not at all what people do. So let's look at the gray bars. What happens is that if you send between 2 and 4 to the other guy, on the average, they send back 4. If you send more, they send back more, and so on. Those are the gray bars. So what it says is, if you give more, they'll send back more. And of course, that's good because the thing is being tripled. So it's obviously more efficient if you get people sending a lot and having a lot tripled and then sharing it in some way. The black bars are really interesting. The variation there says, I'm the first person, and the experimenter says, I can pass some amount to you, and I can also send you a message, which is, if you don't send me back at least X, I'm going to fine you this amount. So essentially giving the first person the power of imposing some incentive on the other person. You can see immediately in the black bars that the level of reciprocity is much less. The people if there's an incentive, a monetary incentive, a threat, if you don't give me back X, I'm going to fine you. It means people don't give back as much. They should, So again, it's a very familiar result here. Now, the reason why I put the white bars in there is because the experimenters very cleverly, in another treatment, gave the first person the right to impose a fine, but they could renounce it. So I could say to Margaret, I'm going to give you the whole pot that I've got, and though I could fine you, I'm not going to fine you. Those are the white bars. And what do you see in the white bars? Tremendous reciprocity. Now, why is that? Because by the experimenter giving me the right to renounce the fine, to impose the fine but not to use it, I could signal to Margaret that I trust her. And then she responds to that. So now this isn't all you would need if you're going to be a mechanism designer trying to figure out how to design incentives and so on. But I think this kind of reasoning is what we should be doing. Sort of figuring out why it's really going on. And I'm going to come back to this game because there's a lot of crowding out here, and I think there's one reason for it, but I'll come to that right at the end. So this is just a summary of what I think are some of the main sources of crowding out. Bad news. Most of these are principal agent problems, like an employer, employee, lender, borrower, and so on. The incentive may convey bad news about the employer. It may be moral disengagement, and it may also be that the people don't like being controlled. That was the main theme in Mark Lepper and his colleagues' research. All those things are probably going on. They're very hard to separate. But I want to, just in case you haven't thought about how a principal-agent model works, the principal, say the employer, is going to design a compensation scheme. Well, how does he or she do that? Well, they figure out their best guess about how the employee is going to respond. And so if I then announce my compensation scheme, it already reveals to you, my employee, what I was thinking about you. So for example, if I propose a compensation scheme in which I'm going to pay you this, some amount and I'm going to supervise you very closely, that means to you that I don't trust you to do the job without the supervision. So you're conveying some news about yourself. And I think that's an important but not the whole story. So let's go on to policy. I greatly regret that Tom Schelling is no longer with us. He did write me when I first published a paper in Science about this. He said, I worked in Washington in the White House at the Executive Office of the President, November 1950 until September 53. Those were exciting and stimulating times. I believe people worked long hours and felt compensated by a sense of accomplishment, and I believe a sense of personal importance. Regularly, a Friday afternoon meeting would go on until 8 or 9 when the chairman would suggest resuming Saturday morning. Nobody demurred. We all knew it was important. We were important. Sometime in 52, I believe it was, President Truman issued an order that anyone who worked on Saturday was to receive overtime pay. What happened? Saturday meetings virtually disappeared. Or here's another example, a rather happier one. This is tax collectors in India having difficulty getting taxes paid. And so what they did is that they sent drummers to the homes of the recalcitrant tax payers, and they drummed outside the homes, and they sent along, of course, clerks with computers and so on to collect any taxes which might be offered under those circumstances, which they were, because, of course, the people in question didn't want to be shamed. I mean, they wanted to be held in high regard by their fellow townspeople. Now, up in the upper right, that's a picture of a charivari in the 14th century. A charivari, those of you who studied European social history know, is a form of protest. Often, for example, these were protests not in public places, for example, the mayor's office, but protests at the homes of people who had violated norms. A very common one was, for example, a baker who was charging high prices during a period of shortage. It was mainly women would go, and they would go with pots and pans and noise-making things, and they would go and essentially draw attention to the transgression. Sexual transgressions were also treated in the same way. Well, this is like a charivari. A charivari works because people actually would like to be held in high regard, and they value that. Here's another example of a charivari-like activity. This is downtown Bogota. The mayor of Bogota, actually a former mathematician, was facing a very serious problem of fatalities at crosswalks called zebras. With taxis were implicated a lot. And the death rate was really extraordinary. Because I didn't believe the reports of this, I actually had to learn a lot about Bogota traffic. So what did he do? He hired clowns, a very large number, I mean hundreds of clowns, and they went to the crosswalks and they ridiculed the taxi drivers who violated the law. And he also he asked citizens to identify particularly nice taxi drivers. And these were all then inducted into the first 100 or so were inducted into the Order of the Zebra. There was one lady of the zebra. There was one lady taxi driver who was also awarded. And so this was a way of basically essentially raising the salience of the moral obligation to actually, drive safely and so on. It's also true at the same time that he increased, but not by much, the severity of the penalties to actually violating the law. And the combination had a fantastic effect. I mean, a really major drop in fatalities of pedestrians. Now, probably those of you who know this literature are shocked that you haven't yet heard an experiment that everybody's heard about. So this is the famous Haifa daycare center story. And if you haven't heard about it, it's okay. but you'll probably be repeating it to your friends because it's really pretty amazing. People coming late to pick up their kids. It was a chain of a dozen or 13 daycare centers. And a very nondescript notice was put on the door. Anybody arriving, as of this coming Sunday, anybody arriving more than 10 minutes late will have to pay a fine of 10 Israeli shekels. They observed the number coming late. That's weeks 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And then in 5, they introduced this thing. And then you see the control schools, the control daycares in which there was no fine. That's the open dots, and the solid dots where the fine was imposed. And that's not a mistake. That is exactly correct, the graph. The top line is the response to the fines. The lateness is doubled. Now think about that. Why did the lateness doubled? Well, there's one explanation is people thought, oh, 10 Israeli shekels, that's not much. If that's all it's costing them for me to come late, then no problem. But the authors of the study thought a more plausible answer is this. By giving it a price, it was something you could just step right up and buy. You want to purchase lateness? Fine, buy it for 10 shekels. By making it something you could purchase, it took it out of the realm of concern for the teachers and so on. I think it's quite reasonable to think the parents who came late did not do so intentionally. They really were worried about the teachers and the inconvenience it might cause and so on. Once given a price, they can say, fine, I'll buy it. Now, I mention that because a very similar case occurred in Ireland. There was a tax on plastic grocery bags, which is a fairly small tax, and it was preceded by a huge campaign, don't trash the Emerald Isle and so on, about how ugly the bags were, caught up in the fences and so on. And it basically, the use of plastic bags disappeared. Really quickly. Plastic bags became something like wearing a fur coat or something like that. So what's the difference? In both cases, a fine was imposed. In one case, they came later. In the other case, they stopped buying plastic bags. We can learn from this. I don't know the answer to that, but this is exactly what we'd like to know, because the second case is something like crowding in. I said some uncomplimentary things about Bentham, but this is a passage, again, from the same text, which I think is really intelligent and we should take seriously. A punishment should be a moral lesson. When by reason of the ignominy it stamps upon the offense, it's calculated to inspire the public with the sentiments of aversion towards those pernicious habits and dispositions with which the offense appears to be connected, and thereby to inculcate the opposite beneficial habits and dispositions. Yes, I think that's exactly right. By the way, notice, he does not say we should come to despise the person who's doing those things, as seems to be a lot of the public shaming in America, but we should despise the habits which led to that behavior. And there is a charivari again. Now, another contrast. In a public goods game, what happens is people contribute a little bit at first, and then they notice other people aren't contributing, and their contributions decline. That's the left-hand side of the panel that's being shown. Various periods of the game, and they're contributing less and less. Then, at I guess round 11, they said, from now on, you'll be informed, not by name, of course, but by number, of what the other people contributed, and you can pay out of your own payoffs. You can take some money out of your own pocket to reduce the payoff of somebody else. We would never use the word punish, but that's the idea. We're going to punish the people who we don't like. Well, what happens, and then you see what happened. As soon as the punishment option was introduced, contributions go up. And by the end of the game, by the way, there's very little punishment because a lot of contributions. People are contributing a lot. Now, just to puzzle you a little bit, the public goods game means I'm going to contribute to the public good, but I'd be better off by not contributing and letting everybody else contribute. The punishment part of that game is also a public goods game. I'd be happy if everybody else punished the people who didn't contribute, and why should I pay for the punishment? The two are exactly the same game, but the second game, people really pay for the punishment. That's an interesting thing about our mentality. That is, we are willing to actually bear some cost to uphold social norms. We should find a way to learn more about that so that we can use it. I want to compare these two cases. Remember, the top is the public goods game I just said, and the bottom is the trust game. I wanted to find out what went wrong in the trust game. But there was an obvious thing that could have gone wrong, and sure enough, when we looked at the data, that was it. You know where the crowding out came from? The crowding out came from the people who said, I give Margaret the whole pot, and then she's going to give stuff back to me. I'm going to fine her unless she gives almost all of it back to me. If you separate this trust game from the ones who made reasonable equal sharing demands, there was no crowding out. And all the crowding out, virtually all of it, an insignificant amount, was associated with the fair demands. The quote unfair demands, or the demands which would get it mostly from me, that's where the problem was. Now, I really love that result. And I don't know enough to give you this as a conclusion. But what it makes me think is this. The problem with the incentive is not that it's an incentive. It's not that it's money. It's that very often incentives are used to dominate people and to exploit people. They're used to transfer a lot of the resource from one party to the other or to control the behavior of another. And when we have crowding out responses, it may very well be that it's not the incentive per se. I hope it's not the incentive per se because we have to use them. It may very well be the injustice or the domination associated with that. Now, I'm not going to give you the take home. I want to go back to Aristotle's legislator. Okay, we're in Athens at the time of Aristotle. They're mounting a big expedition, something like 287 ships with horses and all kinds of things. And they're going to go and establish a colony in the Adriatic. And they have to recruit all of this from the private sector. Wealthy people were appointed to bring a ship to Piraeus, the port, and with detailed specifications. Fairness was assured in this because of the following really brilliant idea, which is the thing called a liturgy. If I'm asked to bring a ship to Piraeus, that's a liturgy. Now, suppose that, and I was chosen because I was rich. But now, suppose that I know that Deborah's richer than me and she didn't get a liturgy. I can go to Deborah and say, Deborah, you take my liturgy. And her choice is she either takes the liturgy or, you ready for this? We exchange our wealth. Yeah. Right? I mean, isn't that a brilliant idea? I'm just making use of decentralized information. This is called an incentive-compatible information extraction mechanism. It's brilliant. And those things actually happened. The incentives were not incentives, they were prizes. Crowns were awarded. The Herald of the Council of 500 is to announce the crowns at the contest of a particular festival in order that the competitive zeal of the triarchs, those bringing the ships, towards the demos may be evident. There was a clear public purpose, like the Irish plastic bag case. The demos will for all future time have its commerce and transport and grain, as well as guarding against the Etruscan pirates. And for those who didn't get their ship there on time, there were huge fines. It's a little bit like the mayor of Bogota, right? You inspire all of this good feeling, and then you also hammer people. So now, most people don't know this, but the Athenians used a time machine, and they went back to Haifa. And the Haifan people then asked them, well, what would you put on the door? Well, here's what was on the door. That's literally, I mean, it's not Hebrew, but it's, that's what was on the door. And as you can see, it's pretty bland. It just says you're going to have to pay the fine. And I happen to have discovered what the Athenians wrote. And this is what they had on the door. The Council of Parents wishes to thank you for arriving on time to pick up your children, since this reduces the anxiety the children sometimes feel and allows our staff to leave in a timely manner to be with their own families. We recognize all parents have a perfect record of unblemished by lateness for the first 3 months, with an award of Israeli shekels 500 to be given at our annual parents and staff holiday party with the option to contribute blah, blah. And it goes on and goes on. I think there's something to learn from that. Remember the subtitle of the Fable of the Bees: human frailties may be turned to the advantage of civil society and made to supply the place of moral virtues. I think we'd better have some second thoughts about that for the reasons that I suggested to begin with. a world connected by, we're connected in our world not just by exchanging, goods, grain and steel. We're also exchanging diseases, and we're exchanging political effects, and we're exchanging information. We're exchanging all kinds of things. We're exchanging climate effects. None of these can be subjected to a complete contract. I mean, not even remotely. And we're really confronting really dangerous things like epidemic spread, the superbugs, and not to mention the more obvious things of climate change and so on. Now, perfecting incentives will play an important role in this, carbon taxes and so on. But those will fail if they compromise moral incentives, because the latter, the moral incentives, are going to be essential to addressing the kind of issues that we face. So we have to confront this problem. We cannot be indifferent to the preferences that we and our fellow citizens have. Now, this may sound shocking and paternalistic and difficult. It surely is difficult, and it could lead to paternalism. But I don't think we have the option of ignoring it. Governments engage in preference formation all the time, and if you don't know that, you haven't been listening to TV lately. Preference formation is a very active part of what governments do through public education, through political discourse, and so on. I want to end with mentioning again Kenneth Arrow. Again, this is a paper of some time ago. He wrote, "Information is a fugitive resource." He talked about the new economy we're entering, in which information is the main idea. And he said in this essay, listen, we can't contract for it, and we can't govern our economy, an economy of knowledge, on the same kind of private property basis which worked reasonably well. Of course, I've been compared to information. It worked reasonably well for grain and steel. It's not going to work for knowledge. That's what he's saying here. We're just beginning to face the contradictions between a system of private property and information acquisition and dissemination. We may see an increasing tension between legal relations and fundamental economic determinants. Now, that tension between the possibilities of a new technology and the institutions which were okay for dealing with the old technology but are fundamentally maladapted for dealing with the new technology, that's a fundamental tension. It comes, and the first person who wrote extensively about that was Karl Marx. Ken was very aware that that's where those ideas came from. He was essentially commenting on that. And let me close with just a note. This is exactly the kind of thing that Ken is talking about. Margaret mentioned CORE, Curriculum Open Access Resources for Education, for economics. And here it is. You can get it on your telephone. Just try it, core-econ.org. It's free. You can get it on your any device. It's a marvelous book now produced by Oxford University Press. We have a very high-tech platform for converting it to any number of languages, which is happening very quickly. It's being used in the top economics departments in Europe as the required intro course at Toulouse School of Economics, for example, at UCL in London, two of the top departments in Europe. It will, I think, it can have a big impact on how we understand economics. I don't have time to say how it differs, but obviously it differs in the sense that it's free, but it's also based on modern economics, the kind of economics I was talking about, in which you do not take for granted that you can have a complete contract, but you take as the base case one in which things like social norms and the exercise of power and the incompleteness of contracts are a fundamental part of the economy. Thank you very much. Yes. Great. I was just trying to get my, yeah. Okay. Questions or comments? Yes.
Just wait for a mic, okay? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, you give him first.
Okay. Get the mic.
She's getting the mic. Yeah, and then.
Okay, Robert Cohan from Princeton. I want to ask you about the Irish bag example and nudges. So my wife and I came from New Jersey to Stanford for 6 months in January. In New Jersey, we're given groceries with a plastic bag. We take the plastic bag, we take it home. usually throw it away. In California, we're asked, do you want a bag? We now at least try to remember to bring our bags to the store ourselves and not get them. That's a pure nudge, no incentive. Can you say a word about the Thaler-Sunstein notion of nudges and how that relates to your talk?
I didn't say anything about that because I wanted to focus on the moral orientation rather than the cognitive processing. But the idea of a nudge is that people often don't reason the way economists think. We're not actually maximizing over the whole space of possible actions, and we'll go for default options. Now, it's very interesting because the idea of putting the more healthy food at eye level in the grocery, or having the default option be a savings plan that actually will work for you, it's hard to see how this really is paternalistic. It's called soft paternalism and so on. It seems to be very justified by what we know about human decision making. I think the fundamental problem is this, that among the arguments for democratic society and among the arguments for personal liberty has always been that we're pretty good at making decisions. I don't mean those are the only arguments, but they're really prominent, that letting people make their own decisions not only is valuable in its own sense because we value privacy and so on, but it leads to good outcomes. Now we have a problem because we're getting a lot of evidence that people aren't very good at making certain kinds of decisions. They don't know what epsilon is, for example. They treat some small non-zero probability as if it was actually not close to zero but really big. And I think these are real dilemmas. And I think there's a wide range of things in which we can improve the governance of our society without facing the really large questions like under what conditions does a town, suppose you're a town planner and you know that this nuclear facility will generate a lot of jobs for your community and it has an epsilon chance that it'll blow up. But the public thinks that epsilon is actually a pretty big number. And so so are you now going to be a Democrat and therefore let this thing come to a referendum? Or are you going to be a utilitarian and try to introduce the thing because you know it actually, in extremely high probability it's good for them? Now, I don't know what the answer to that is. It's not at all obvious. That would be a kind of, that's more than a nudge. That's basically saying, let's not let this be voted on because, what? Because if that's what we're going to say, then what else comes under that realm that we shouldn't have people voting on? And I think those are really hard problems. But again, they should be on the table because if they're not being on the table, it's just because we're trying to get something difficult off the table. Yeah.
Right here.
Oh, sorry.
Hi, I'm Dhaval. I'm a Stanford alumni. The question I had.
Thank you.
Hello. The question I had was with respect to these examples that the title is quite commonsensically obvious, but the examples also you gave were quite nice and simple to understand the concepts. Do you also, in your literature, have advanced examples where it's more complicated and you sort of combine 2-3 examples and they become like sort of transitive, and then it applies to a lot of complicated situations also and it can be figured out with your framework?
I think I tend to go for the simple examples, and it's not primarily because of the communication. It's because, to be perfectly honest, I've been working on this project. I first wrote this more than 20 years ago, and I've been working ever since on it. It's very hard to understand these things. So when you get a lot of complexity, you sort of lose track of what's really going on. Now, that's not great, because if you're a policymaker, you can't simplify the world. You've got to deal with the complexity of it. And I think that what I'm confessing is the very primitive nature of my knowledge of these subjects, even having spent a long time studying them. What I'm convinced of and passionate about is that we've got to deal with these questions scientifically as best we can. I'm not, while I'm passionate about that, I'm far from convinced that I'm right about the details, or even about some of the big stuff. I could be very wrong. It's just hard stuff. Yeah. Oh. Oh, wait. I guess I'm not calling on people. No, no, Joni, go ahead. You do it.
Okay, thank you. Nicholas Beale from London. There was a very good seminar last month at the London School of Economics by Peter Andrews, who'd been the chief economist for the financial regulator for a long time and had just retired, on his reflections on financial regulation and the practical difficulties of applying economics and behavioral economics to it from policy point of view, which is well worth looking at. The slides are online. But the question came up, is economics a science? And the answer was suggested, it is and ought to be a science, but it ought to be a moral science. And would you agree or have comments on the idea that we need to recover the idea of economics as a moral science rather than trying to be a kind of quasi-physical science, which it obviously isn't?
Well, first about is economics a science? The methods that we use in economics to try to figure out the way the world works are common across all of the sciences. We have challenges that don't exist in physics and in other fields, but I don't think there's any distinctive methods that we have that are not just standard scientific methods. And I think the idea that there's some special way that that economists can figure out what's true is just just mistaken. And I think economics has done a fantastic job in, for example, in the last 3 decades, really taking seriously causation and what it means and how you establish it. My view about all of this, as you can probably tell, is the kind of knowledge I'm interested in ultimately is the kind of knowledge that can help us intervene in the world. And that means being able to make causal statements about if you do this, this is going to be the consequence. I make no, some people, because of the arrogance of some disciplines, I know, including economics, people often use the word science with inverted commas, sort of with embarrassment. I never do. I'm very happy to be a scientist and to use those methods as best I can, recognizing that, of course, the kinds of uncertainties we're faced are really huge by comparison to the kinds of uncertainties that you face if you're doing particle physics or statistical physics and so on. That said, now, what is the role, in what sense is it a moral science? Well, if you have the view that I do, which is that we're acquiring this knowledge so as to intervene in the world to make it a better place to live, then you have to ask yourself, well, what would that mean? Is it a better place for people to live who are the least well off? Is it a better place, does the better place to live extend beyond the national boundaries? There are all of these questions which are profoundly difficult, including the ones I raised about paternalism. These are all fundamental moral questions. They're also practical questions, but they're irreducibly moral. And I think it's really shocking that economists are no longer given any sense of how to reason in the moral realm when, in fact, they get so engaged in the moral realm when they do the practice of economics. I'm not saying that economists should be trained to think this is fair or that's not fair. It's that trained economists are really not much different from undergraduates when it gets to ethical questions. They say, well, I think this, and the other person says, I think that. And that's the end of the conversation. I mean, we do have a language for talking about justice. I mean, we've been studying it for a long time. We can really narrow the disagreements by the correct use of interesting examples and veils of ignorance and all of the methods that we can think about. There's a lot that economists have to learn about moral language, and I think it's really awful. And by the way, the core economics curriculum that I mentioned, right from the start, it has all kinds of questions about procedural justice, substantive justice, veils of ignorance, and so on. Students absolutely love it. They get very engaged. And we're trying to sort of narrow the bounds of subjectivity. Never because we can eliminate it. Of course we can't, and we shouldn't. But we can surely narrow it. Am I calling? Yeah. The orange shirt. That's it.
I wanted to ask your opinion about the interplay of incentive theory that you described and negotiations, both in a business setting as well as in community of nations, international affairs setting. In particular, let's say when the Berlin Wall fell, Gorbachev was stricken by some ideas of freedom and things of that nature from the West. Today, we use sanctions and other kinds of hyperbole to manage certain very rogue states. Same thing with, like, at the height of the financial crisis, the Fed was able to convince a bank to buy another bank, even though it might not have been in their long-term interest. But so, want to understand to what extent negotiations are incomplete contracts, especially in the community of nations. It's very hard to be paternalistic about the outcomes. So to what extent would you say that there is some interplay there, and how one should reason with these findings in the context of negotiations?
To be perfectly honest, I have thought about that, but I can't say I've made a lot of progress. I mean, there's some obvious things that come directly from I think the evidence, which is that in things like negotiations, even among parties which appear to be sharply contesting, for example, employers, employees, and so on, there's a very strong moral element in gain sharing. It's very hard, for example, to sort of drive a hard bargain, to reduce the opponent to their fallback position, and so on. It just isn't acceptable. Now, I don't know how that works, but I think that one of the, because we have such a vast body of knowledge about capital labor negotiations, that's a place I would start. And in thinking about where's the moral element come in. Jan Elster has a very good book, which was actually built around the social norms, but he used the example of bargaining in the Nordic countries. And that, but I don't have much to say about that, except that it's pretty clear that we're not acting like Homo economicus at all in those bargains. Yes, way in the back. Can you get a mic?
Thank you. So I'm curious on the topic of information and perfect information, imperfect information. I'm an anthropologist, not an economist, so forgive me.
That's okay. I'm a recreational anthropologist.
Okay. So I'm really curious about incentive structures in, I guess, N is bigger than 2 situations where you have multiple parties who are exchanging information when there seems to be some form of structure or incentive for them giving disinformation to the other parties. I guess I'm asking about fake news or whatever you want to call it, but I'm just curious, like, it strikes me that, like, they can claim to have some sort of moral purpose that they're doing this, and I'm wondering what is happening with sort of out-grouping, in-grouping people in these situations, and is there a way that we can attempt to have incentives placed in here?
I'm not sure about how the incentives can address that, but one of the things that I've thought quite a bit about is that it's usually a mistake to interpret people who you disapprove of as being self-interested. So, for example, a common understanding of why the welfare state is so weak in America is because American voters are selfish. And if you actually look at the focus groups or look at the surveys and so on, that's not at all the case. When people are talking about the welfare state, they use deeply moral terms, the ones who are for it and the ones who are against it. And the rhetoric of deservingness, for example, is really very, very important. A lot of debates about what that is, and a lot of that is informed by misinformation, often of a very racist kind. But I haven't thought about the incentives for. I mean, obviously, one of the ways we try to deal with fake news is not a new idea. Is that people's reputations have to suffer if they're the origin of it, and that's basic point. We hope that can be achieved. We worry a little bit about it.
Last one.
Yes.
Do you have any thoughts on UBI?
On.
Universal basic income.
I do, and the unconditional basic income grant is the idea that you pay individuals or families, but by individuals, some amount unconditionally. And the advantage of this is that it does absolutely away with means testing. It's very cheap to administer, and it could vastly increase both the freedom and also security of the least well off. If it were I mean, I'll give you a rather nasty version of the basic income idea. Suppose instead of having unemployment insurance, you just had a basic income grant. This could be financed by a very substantial tax on wages. Suppose you believe, as I do, that you can't fundamentally reduce the after-tax profit rate, or you can't reduce it very much without there being serious negative consequences. If you're going to fund this thing, you have to fund it by taxes on labor, on a factor which is not mobile. Well, you could raise a lot of taxes if you got rid of unemployment insurance, because the wage could be lowered and people would still be scared of losing their job. Why? Because they wouldn't get any compensation because of being unemployed. They would have the basic income grant whether they were employed or not. And I mean, that's, I know you don't like the sound of that, because having unemployment insurance is actually a very reasonable kind of insurance for a society to have. But it does have if you didn't do that, if you just said, we're going to have unemployment insurance, we're going to accept my rules of the game, which is you can't really depress the after-tax profit rate very much, so it's going to be funded essentially by wages and salaries. If you don't get rid of the unemployment benefit, if you keep that, then it would have to be fairly small. If you get rid of the unemployment benefit, it can be extremely large, and it could really make a big difference. I'm not sure if that would be good social policy, though, because my sense is that we should be thinking of vastly expanding the areas of insurance that the government engages in, where that can be done in an incentive-compatible way, where there are ways in which the insured cannot exploit the insurance by adopting risky behaviors. I think that, house price insurance could be a very good idea. Think about the risk exposure of most people. What are we exposed to? The value of our house may fall, or we may have a serious health episode. Now, those are things, and so, the vast majority of the population is so risk exposed, no wonder people are risk averse. And how do you expect those people to engage in a dynamic, innovative society? And those are problems we know how to fix. I mean, it's not, you don't have to be an innovator in public policy to figure out a way to insulate people from vagaries of the housing market or vagaries of health in ways that are incentive compatible, meaning that the amount paid to somebody cannot be manipulated by their own actions and their own interests. So, for example, house insurance would be, suppose my house is insured that its value doesn't fall. Then I might not take care of my house. Okay, well then your house insurance is going to be based on the average house price in your SMSA, in your standard statistical area. Well, I can't affect that by taking care of my house or not. So that's just an example. There's all kinds of insurance we could give to people which would reduce their risk exposure and make them able to participate in the innovation process, which we now have to all be engaged in, because we don't really know where the best good idea is going to come from now. So we really have to get away from the idea that those who are the innovators and so on are a very small class of very rich people who are roughly risk neutral and able to insure themselves. So I'll leave you with the idea that in the end, we should all think of ourselves as knowledge hunters. I love the analogy to the hunter-gatherers, who had a very good insurance scheme, namely the common pot of the resources. That idea that you can't have an innovative society if only a third or a quarter have the economic wherewithal to actually participate in that, that's something we should really consider. Be more like Finland, maybe. Thank you.
Thank you.